Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, and here, every whisper hides a mystery. These Miss Marple stories are my own creations, written just for you. So lean in and let the clues begin. Picture Yew Tree Lodge, a grand English estate where blackbirds sing and secrets fester. When wealthy Rex Fortescue collapses, poisoned by his morning tea with rye grains in his pocket, a chilling nursery rhyme begins to unfold. His glamorous wife, Adele, falls next, cyanide in her marmalade, followed by the timid maid Gladys, strangled with a clothes peg on her nose. Each death echoes, "Sing a song of sixpence," a sinister script guiding a cunning killer. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster, unraveling greed, betrayal, and a hidden fortune tied to a failed African mine. Who's behind this deadly game, and will the final verse claim another victim? The truth lies in the shadows of Yew Tree Lodge. Chapter 1. The blackbirds begin to sing. Yew Tree Lodge was one of those houses that seemed to have grown out of the landscape rather than been imposed upon it. Built in the late Victorian era, it sprawled across the gentle slopes of Baden Heath with an air of solid, unpretentious prosperity. The yew trees from which it took its name flanked the drive like somber sentinels, their dark foliage casting long shadows even on the brightest days. It was the sort of place where one might expect nothing more dramatic than a heated discussion over bridge scores or the occasional squabble among the staff. Rex Fortescue, the master of Yew Tree Lodge, was a man who had clawed his way up from modest beginnings to command a financial empire that stretched from the city of London to the gold fields of South Africa. At 68, he retained the sharp eyes and predatory instincts of his youth, though his once lean frame had softened with the indulgences of success. He sat now in his study, a room lined with leather-bound ledgers and the faint scent of cigar smoke, poring over a stack of cables from overseas. The morning sun slanted through the mullioned windows, illuminating the headlines of the financial pages spread before him. "Damned fools," he muttered, crumpling a telegram in his fist. "Blackbird mine. Ha! More like a black hole for my money." He reached for the bell pull and tugged it impatiently. Moments later, the door opened to admit Gladys Martin, the parlor maid, bearing a tray with his customary pot of tea. "Morning, sir," she said, setting it down with a clatter that betrayed her nerves. Gladys was a plain girl from the villages, with mousy hair and a tendency to blush under scrutiny. She had been in service at Yew Tree Lodge for scarcely 6 months, recommended by a distant connection in Saint, Mary Mead. Rex grunted without looking up. "That all? No sugar, mind?" "No, sir, just as you like it." Gladys bobbed a curtsy and retreated, closing the door softly behind her. He poured the tea into a heavy china cup, black and steaming, and took a long sip. For a brief instant, his face relaxed, the lines of tension easing. Then, abruptly, his hand flew to his throat. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the parquet floor as tea spread in a dark stain. Rex Fortescue gasped, his eyes bulging in sudden, incomprehensible agony. He staggered to his feet, knocking over the inkstand, and clutched at the desk for support. "Help! Poison!" The words were a strangled whisper. He collapsed forward, his body convulsing once before going still. It was Mary Dove, the efficient housekeeper, who discovered him scarcely 10 minutes later. She had come to inquire about luncheon arrangements and let out a sharp cry at the sight. "Mr. Fortescue, oh heavens!" She knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse, but there was none. The room seemed unnaturally quiet, broken only by the distant chatter of blackbirds in the garden. The household erupted into controlled chaos. Adele Fortescue, Rex's second wife, was summoned from her boudoir where she had been applying a fresh layer of rouge. At 35, Adele was a striking woman with platinum hair and a figure that spoke of careful diets and expensive corsetry. She had married Rex for his money, as everyone quietly assumed, and he for her decorative qualities. "Dead? But how?" she exclaimed, her hand fluttering to her throat as she stared at the body. Percival Fortescue, the elder son, arrived next, his face pale beneath its habitual mask of respectability. Percival was a partner in the family firm, Consolidated Investments, a man of ledgers and caution, married to a sensible woman named Elaine, who managed the household accounts with scrupulous care. "Father, this is impossible," he said, his voice tight. He glanced at the spilled tea and the scattered papers, his mind already turning to the implications for the business. Lancelot Fortescue, the younger son, was absent that morning, having driven into town on some errand of his own. Lance, as he was known, had been the family's wanderer, exiled to the colonies after a youthful scandal, only recently returned with tales of adventure and a charming smile that masked whatever bitterness lingered. The doctor, summoned hastily from the village, pronounced death by poisoning almost at once. "Taxine, I'd wager," he said gravely, noting the symptoms. "From yew berries, perhaps. Deadly stuff." He pocketed his stethoscope and shook his head. "Scotland Yard will need to be informed." Inspector Neal arrived by midday, a solid, unassuming man with a deceptively mild manner that had unraveled many a tangled web. He surveyed the study with keen eyes, noting the rye grains that had spilled from Rex's pocket onto the floor, odd, inexplicable details that niggled at his orderly mind. "Rye? In his pocket," he murmured to his sergeant. "Not the sort of thing a financier carries about." Questioning began in the drawing room, a chintz-filled space overlooking the lawns where blackbirds flitted among the bushes. Adele, composed, now in a black dress that accentuated her pallor, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Rex was perfectly well at breakfast," she insisted. "He complained of nothing beyond the usual business worries." Percival nodded agreement. Father had been involved in some speculative ventures. The Blackbird mine, for one, it's been a drain. But enemies? In the city, perhaps, but not here. Neil made notes, his expression neutral. "And the tea? Who prepared it?" "Gladys, the maid," Mary Dove interjected smoothly. "But she's a harmless girl. I supervised the kitchen myself." As the inspector probed further, a nursery rhyme flitted unbidden into his thoughts, something about blackbirds baked in a pie. He dismissed it as fanciful, yet the image lingered, like the shadow of those yew trees across the drive. Outside, the blackbirds sang on, oblivious to the darkness that had descended upon Yew Tree Lodge. Chapter 2. The Maid's Tale. Inspector Neal stood in the servants' hall of Yew Tree Lodge, a narrow room tucked away at the back of the house, where the air carried the mingled scents of polished silver and yesterday's roast. The hall was sparsely furnished, a long oak table scarred from years of use, a few straight-backed chairs, and a high window that let in a sliver of afternoon light, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was here that the lower orders of the household conducted their daily lives, far from the opulent drawing rooms and studies where the Fortescues reigned. Gladys Martin sat at one end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, twisting a damp handkerchief between her fingers. She was a girl of about 22, with a round face that might have been pretty if not for the perpetual look of anxiety that creased her forehead. Her uniform, a black dress with a crisp white apron, was impeccably neat, but her eyes, wide and darting, betrayed the turmoil within. Inspector Neal, seated opposite her with his notebook open, observed her closely. He had a way of looking at people that made them feel as though he could see straight through to their secrets, a talent honed over years of dealing with the guilty and the innocent alike. "Now, Miss Martin," he began in his calm, measured tone, "let's go over it again, shall we? From the beginning? You prepared Mr. Fortescue's tea this morning?" Gladys nodded vigorously, her voice coming out in a whisper. "Yes, sir. Just like every morning. I boiled the kettle in the kitchen, measured out the leaves, Indian tea, he liked it strong, and poured it into the pot. No milk, no sugar. He always took it black." "And did anyone else handle the tray before you brought it to him?" She shook her head, her mousy curls bobbing. "No, sir. Cook was busy with the breakfast things, and Mary Dove, that's the housekeeper, she was upstairs seeing to Mrs. Fortescue's room. I carried it straight to the study myself." Neal made a note, his pen scratching softly against the paper. "And Mr. Fortescue, did he seem his usual self when you entered?" He grunted something about the post being late, sir. Didn't look up from his papers. He was always like that. Busy, you know? Important man, he was." Her voice trailed off, and she glanced toward the door as if expecting interruption. The inspector leaned forward slightly. "You seem nervous, Miss Martin. Is there something you're not telling me?" Gladys flushed, her cheeks turning a mottled red. It's awful, sir. Him dying like that, and me being the one who brought the tea. What if it was something in it?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she dabbed at them with the handkerchief. Neal regarded her sympathetically, though his mind was already cataloging possibilities. Poison in the tea, toxine, as the doctor had confirmed. But how? And by whom? "We'll get to the bottom of it," he assured her. "Now, how long have you been in service here?" 6 months, sir. Came from St. Mary Mead. It was a step up, you see. Better wages, and the house is ever so grand." She paused, biting her lip. "But it's not been easy. The families, well, they're not like folks back home." "Tell me about the family," Neal prompted, sensing an opening. Gladys hesitated. Then the words tumbled out as if a dam had broken. "Mr. Fortescue was the head, of course, strict, but fair in his way. Paid on time, didn't quibble over extras. Mrs. Fortescue, Adele, they call her, she's younger, likes her London trips and fancy clothes. Doesn't pay much mind to us downstairs, except when she wants something done quick. Then there's Mr. Percival. He's the eldest son, lives here with his wife, Mrs. Elaine. He's all business, like his father. Knows always in the accounts. Mrs. Elaine's quiet, keeps to herself mostly, but she's kind, slipped me a bit extra at Christmas. And the younger son? Mr. Lancelot?" Gladys's expression shifted, a mix of admiration and wariness. "Lance, they call him. He's only just come back from abroad. Africa, I think. Full of stories, he is. Charming like. Makes you laugh. But there's something about him. The way he looks at you sometimes, as if he's sizing you up." Neal nodded, filing away the observation. "Any quarrels in the house? Arguments you've overheard?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, families do argue. Mr. Fortescue and Mr. Percival had words now and then. About money, I think. And Mr. Lance, He and his father didn't see eye to eye when he first arrived, shouting in the study one night. But that's normal, isn't it? Perhaps, Neil said non-committally. And visitors? Anyone unusual lately? There's Mr. Dubois, Vivian Dubois, comes for golf lessons with Mrs. Fortescue. Handsome fellow, stays for tea sometimes. Gladys lowered her voice. Cook says there's talk, but I don't listen to gossip. The inspector made another note. Gossip, in his experience, often held kernels of truth. Thank you, Miss Martin. That'll do for now. If you remember anything else, come to me straight away. As Gladys rose to leave, her relief palpable, Neil watched her go. She was frightened, that much was clear. But of what? Being implicated, or something more? He moved next to the drawing room, where the family had gathered in a semblance of mourning. The room was elegantly appointed, with deep armchairs upholstered in faded brocade, a marble fireplace surmounted by a portrait of Rex Fortescue in his prime, and French windows opening onto the terrace. Outside, the blackbirds continued their ceaseless activity, their calls a mocking counterpoint to the somber atmosphere within. Adele Fortescue reclined on a chaise longue, a vinaigrette clutched in one hand, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. She was dressed in a silk wrapper, her hair slightly disheveled, a picture of genteel distress. Percival stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the garden. Elaine Fortescue, his wife, sat nearby, her plain face composed, though her knitting needles clicked with unusual rapidity. A sign of inner tension, Neil noted. Mrs. Fortescue, the inspector began, addressing Adele. I understand this is a difficult time, but I must ask a few questions. Adele sat up, dabbing at her eyes. Of course, Inspector. Anything to find out who did this dreadful thing. Her voice was husky, with a trace of theatricality that made Neil wonder how genuine her grief was. Can you think of anyone who might have wished harm to your husband? She hesitated, then sighed. Rex was a powerful man, Inspector. In business, he made enemies, rivals in the city, perhaps. There were deals that went sour, investments in mines, shipping. He mentioned once or twice about threats, but I never took them seriously. Threats? Neil leaned forward. What kind? Anonymous letters, I believe. Percival knows more about that. Percival turned from the window, his expression grave. Yes, Father received a couple last month, vague accusations about past dealings, something to do with a company he took over years ago. Called him a thief in the counting house. We thought it was a crank. Neil jotted it down. Counting house? It echoed that silly rhyme again. And where are these letters now? In Father's desk, I imagine. I'll fetch them if you like. As Percival left the room, the door opened to admit Lancelot Fortescue. Lance was the antithesis of his brother, tall, dark-haired, with a roguish charm that lit up his features. He wore a tweed jacket with leather patches, as if fresh from a country ramble, and carried the faint scent of cigarette smoke. Sorry I'm late to the Inquisition, he said lightly, dropping into an armchair. Been out clearing my head. Ghastly business, this. Neil studied him. Indeed, Mr. Fortescue. Where were you this morning? In town, Inspector. Picking up some things. Cigarettes, newspapers, alibi witnesses, aplenty if needed. His smile was disarming, but his eyes were watchful. And your relationship with your father? Lance shrugged. Complicated, as family ties often are. He shipped me off to Africa after a spot of trouble in my youth, thought it would make a man of me. I suppose it did. Came back a few weeks ago, hat in hand. We were patching things up." Adele interjected, her voice sharp. "Patching up? You argued with him just last night, Lance." Lance's smile faded slightly. "A minor disagreement over finances, nothing murderous." Percival returned then, handing over a sheaf of letters. They were typed on cheap paper, the words crude. "You'll pay for what you stole, king of the counting house." Neil read them carefully, noting the postmarks from London. "Interesting," he murmured. "We'll have these checked for fingerprints." The conversation continued, with Elaine contributing little beyond affirmations of her husband's statements. She was a mousy woman, devoted to Percival, with a habit of fading into the background. Yet Neela sensed a quiet strength in her, a watchfulness that belied her demure exterior. As the interview wound down, Neil excused himself, his mind buzzing with impressions. The family presented a united front, but cracks were evident, jealousies, old grudges, financial strains. And then there was the maid, Gladys, with her nervous demeanor. Unbeknownst to the inspector, Gladys had retreated to her attic room, a cramped space under the eaves furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small writing desk. She sat there now, pen in hand, composing a letter by the light of a single bulb. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this finds you well. You remember me, Gladys Martin, who worked for Mrs. Bantry before coming here. Something terrible has happened at Yew Tree Lodge. Mr. Fortescue is dead. Poisoned, they say. And I was the one who made his tea. I'm frightened, miss. There's queer things going on. Arguments, strangers about. And those blackbirds in the garden, always singing like they know something. Please, if you can, come and help. I don't know who else to turn to. Yours respectfully, Gladys." She sealed the envelope, addressing it to Saint Mary Mead, and slipped it into her pocket. Tomorrow, on her half-day off, she would post it. Little did she know that this simple act would draw into the web an elderly spinster whose unassuming appearance masked a mind as sharp as any detective's. Meanwhile, downstairs, the household settled into an uneasy routine. Mary Dove, the housekeeper, oversaw the preparation of a cold luncheon, her efficient manner masking a keen interest in the proceedings. She had her own suspicions, gleaned from years of observing the family's undercurrents. "Poison," she murmured to the cook in the kitchen. "It's always the quiet ones you have to watch." The cook, a stout woman named Crump, snorted. "Quiet? That Adele's no saint, and that Dubois fellow, sneaking about like a cat after cream." Upstairs, Adele retired to her room, drawing the curtains against the afternoon light. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Rex's death was a shock, yes, but also, perhaps, an opportunity. The will, she knew, left her comfortably provided for. And Vivian, dear Vivian. She smiled faintly, recalling their last meeting on the golf course, his hand lingering on hers. Percival, in his father's study, rifled through the desk drawers, ostensibly organizing papers, but in truth searching for any clue to the firm's precarious state. The Blackbird mine investment had been a disaster, draining resources. If word got out... He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. Lance, meanwhile, wandered the garden, lighting a cigarette as he paced the paths. The blackbirds scattered at his approach, their wings fluttering like dark omens. He thought of his father's last words to him. "You'll get nothing from me, boy. Not until you prove yourself." Well, now the old man was gone. Lance's lips curved in a sardonic smile. Prove himself? Perhaps he already had. Inspector Neal, driving back to the local station, reviewed the day's findings. The rye in the pocket, peculiar. And the rhyme? Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye. Children's nonsense or a deliberate clue. He resolved to dig deeper into Rex Fortescue's business affairs. Back at Yew Tree Lodge, as evening fell, the house seemed to hold its breath. The blackbirds roosted in the yews, their songs silenced for the night. But the tale of the maid, with its hints of fear and foreboding, was only the beginning of a darker story unfolding within those walls. Gladys, unable to sleep, tossed in her bed, replaying the morning's events. The teapot, the cup, Mr. Fortescue's grunt. Had she missed something? A shadow in the pantry, perhaps? No, it was imagination. Yet the fear gnawed at her. In the village inn where Neela had taken rooms, he pored over his notes by lamplight. The anonymous letters suggested a grudge from the past. But poison was intimate, administered in the home. Family or servant, or an outsider like Dubois. The next day dawned gray and drizzly, the blackbirds huddled under the eaves. Gladys posted her letter in the village, her heart lighter for the act. Miss Marple, she knew, had a way of seeing through tangles. Neal returned to the lodge, this time to interview the staff more thoroughly. Crump the cook was voluble, recounting kitchen routines with gusto. I baked a pie last night, blackbird pie, decorative-like, stuffed birds from the shop. Mr. Fortescue laughed at it. Neal's ears pricked up. Blackbird pie? Aye, 4 and 20, just like the rhyme. The inspector felt a chill. Rye in the pocket, blackbirds in a pie. The rhyme was no coincidence. He questioned Mary Dove next. The housekeeper was poised, her answers precise. I've been here 3 years, no troubles until now. And your opinion of the family? She hesitated. Mr. Fortescue was demanding. Mrs. Fortescue, frivolous. The sons, Percival reliable, Lance, unpredictable. Unpredictable how? He's charming, but there's a recklessness. Came back with no money, expecting handouts. Neal nodded. Motive there, perhaps. As the day progressed, he spoke with Vivian Dubois, summoned to the lodge. Dubois was suave, mid-30s, with polished manners and a faint French accent. I give lessons to Madame Fortescue. Golf, you understand. And your relationship? Purely professional. But his eyes shifted. Adele, overhearing, flushed. Vivian is a friend, Inspector. Nothing more. Neal let it pass for now. By evening, the household tension mounted. Dinner was a subdued affair, with Lance cracking jokes that fell flat. Father would hate this gloom. He'd say, "Buck up, life's for the living." Percival scowled. "Show some respect." Elaine mediated. "We're all upset." Adele retired early, pleading headache. In her room, Gladys unpacked a small suitcase, pondering escape. But no, she'd wait for Miss Marple's reply. Far away in St. Mary Mead, the letter arrived the next morning. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cozy sitting room with its chintz curtains and shelves of detective novels, slit open the envelope. Her blue eyes, faded but sharp, scanned the lines. "Poor girl," she murmured to her maid, Dolly. "Sounds in a state. Nursery rhymes and poison. Reminds me of that affair with the crooked house." She set the letter down, her mind already turning. Human nature was the same everywhere. Greed, jealousy, fear. She'd go to Baden Heath. After all, what harm could an old lady do? Back at Yew Tree Lodge, Inspector Neal pursued leads. A search of Rex's papers revealed discrepancies in the accounts, funds siphoned to unknown sources. Percival blustered explanations. Father's private investments. Lance, questioned again, admitted borrowing money, but not enough to kill for. Gladys, overhearing snippets, grew more frightened. That night, she dreamed of blackbirds pecking at rye fields, their beaks stained red. The chapter of the maid's tale was weaving itself into the larger tapestry, each thread pulling tighter toward revelation. But for now, the house slept uneasily, secrets lurking in every shadow. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Rhyme. The drizzle that had begun the previous evening thickened into a steady rain by the morning, cloaking Yew Tree Lodge in a damp, oppressive mist. The yew trees, their branches heavy with moisture, seemed to lean closer to the house, their dark forms mirrored in the puddles that gathered on the gravel drive. Inside, the atmosphere was no less heavy, the air thick with unspoken suspicions, and the faint, lingering scent of tragedy. The blackbirds, undeterred by the weather, flitted among the shrubs, their sharp calls cutting through the gloom like fragments of an old, half-forgotten song. Inspector Neal stood in the dining room, where the remains of last night's dinner, a curious pie stuffed with decorative blackbirds, had been left on a sideboard, covered with a cloth. He lifted the cloth now, examining the pie with a frown. The taxidermied birds, their glass eyes glinting, were an oddity, ordered specially from a London curiosity shop at Rex Fortescue's whim. 24 blackbirds, baked in a pie, Neal murmured, the nursery rhyme surfacing unbidden. First the rye grains in Rex's pocket, now this. Was it a prank, a taunt, or something more sinister? He turned to Mary Dove, the housekeeper, who hovered nearby, her sharp features composed but her eyes alert. This pie, Miss Dove, who suggested it? Mr. Fortescue himself, sir, she replied promptly. He saw it in some magazine, a novelty for the table, thought it would amuse the family. I placed the order with the shop myself. And who handled it in the kitchen? Crump, the cook, prepared the crust. The birds were delivered ready stuffed. I checked them myself, nothing but sawdust and feathers inside. Her tone was matter of fact, but Neal sensed a guardedness, as if she were measuring her words. He nodded, making a mental note to have the pie analyzed, though he doubted it held the poison that killed Rex. Taxine, the doctor had confirmed, was derived from yew berries, not baked into pastry. Still, the rhyme nagged at him, its rhythm echoing the odd details of the case. He excused Mary Dove and moved to the library, where he had arranged to meet the family again. The library was a grand room, its walls lined with books that looked more decorative than read, their spines uncracked. A fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the Fortescues, who sat in an uneasy tableau. Adele Fortescue, draped in a black shawl, sipped a cup of tea with delicate precision, her eyes darting occasionally to the door. Percival stood by a bookcase, flipping through a ledger with an air of distraction, while Elaine, his wife, sat knitting in a corner, her needles clicking rhythmically. Lancelot lounged by the fire, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his expression one of studied nonchalance. "Mrs. Fortescue," Neal began, addressing Adele, "I'd like to revisit your husband's business dealings. You mentioned enemies in the city. Can you recall any specific names?" Adele set down her cup, her movements deliberate. "Rex never shared details with me, Inspector. He said business was no place for a woman's mind. But I heard him mention a Mr. Mackenzie once, a Canadian, I think, something about a mine that went wrong. Rex was furious, said the man had tried to ruin him." Percival looked up sharply. "Mackenzie? That was years ago, a bad investment, nothing more. The man's likely dead by now. Neil made a note. And these anonymous letters your father received, any mention of Mackenzie? Not that I recall, Percival said, his voice clipped. They were vague, spiteful things. I told father to ignore them. Lancelot exhaled a plume of smoke. Father never ignored a slight. Percy, you know that. He'd have hunted down whoever wrote them if he'd had the chance. Elaine's needles paused. Please, Lance, this isn't the time. Neil observed the exchange, noting the undercurrents of tension. Mr. Fortescue, Lancelot, where were you last night after your argument with your father? Lance's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained light. Out for a stroll, Inspector. Needed air after the old man's lecture on my spendthrift ways. Ask the gardener. He saw me by the rose beds. The inspector jotted it down, though he knew alibis could be fabricated. He turned to Elaine. Mrs. Fortescue, you were here all evening? Yes, she said softly, resuming her knitting. I retired early with a book. Percival was in his study, working. Percival nodded confirmation, but Neil sensed a stiffness in his posture, as if he were guarding something. The inspector's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Sergeant Hay entered, his face grim. Sir, we've had a report from the lab. The tea leaves from the pot, traces of taxine, mixed in, deliberate-like. The room fell silent. Adele's hand trembled, spilling a drop of tea onto her shawl. Percival's jaw tightened, and Lance stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. Elaine's needles stilled again, her eyes fixed on her husband. Deliberate, Neil repeated, his voice calm but his mind racing. Someone in this house, then. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Neil excused himself to confer with Hay in the hall. Check the kitchen thoroughly, he instructed. Every jar, every packet, and find out who had access to those yew trees. Back in the servants' quarters, Gladys Martin was scrubbing the kitchen floor, her movements mechanical. The news of the poisoned tea had spread below stairs, and the other servants whispered behind her back. She made the tea, Crump muttered to the scullery maid. What if she slipped something in? Gladys overheard and bit her lip, her hands shaking as she wrung out the cloth. She hadn't told the inspector everything, not about the odd moment in the pantry that morning, when she thought she heard a rustle behind the shelves. It was probably nothing, she told herself, but the fear lingered. She thought of her letter to Miss Marple, now on its way to St. Mary Mead, and prayed for a swift reply. Meanwhile, in the village, Vivian Dubois sat in the lounge of the Baden Heath Arms, nursing a brandy. He was a man of polished charm, with dark hair slicked back and a wardrobe that spoke of tailored elegance. The locals eyed him with curiosity. He was an outsider, after all, and his frequent visits to Yew Tree Lodge had not gone unnoticed. When Neil arrived to question him, Dubois greeted him with a disarming smile. "Inspector, a pleasure, though the circumstances are grim. How can I assist?" "Your relationship with Mrs. Fortescue," Neil said bluntly. "There's talk of intimacy." Dubois laughed softly, shaking his head. "Gossip, Inspector. I teach Adele golf. She's a charming woman, but our interactions are strictly professional. Rex was a friend in his way, generous with introductions to his business associates. And you were at the house yesterday? For an hour in the afternoon, Adele and I practiced her swing on the lawn. I left before dinner." Neil noted the alibi, to be verified later. Did you notice anything unusual? Arguments? Tensions? Dubois hesitated, then leaned forward. Between you and me, Inspector, Rex was under strain. He mentioned a deal going sour, something about a mine in Africa, said someone was out to get him. Someone specific? He didn't say, but he was jumpy, not his usual self. Neil thanked him and left, his suspicions deepening. Back at Yew Tree Lodge, he sought out Mary Dove. Again, this time in the conservatory, where she was arranging flowers with precise, practiced movements. "Miss Dove," he said, "you've been here 3 years. You must know the family's habits well. Who might have had reason to harm Mr. Fortescue?" She snipped a rose stem, her expression unreadable. "Reason, Inspector. Money's usually the root of it. Mr. Fortescue controlled the purse strings tightly. Percival depended on him for the firm's stability. Lance? Well, he's come back expecting a share, hasn't he? And Mrs. Fortescue?" Mary's lips twitched. "Adele likes her comforts. Rex's death leaves her well off, I imagine." Neil pressed further. "And this pie, the blackbird pie, was it served to anyone else?" "No, sir, just a centerpiece, really. The family ate roast lamb instead." He let her go, his mind turning to the rhyme again. "When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. But these birds were dead, stuffed for show. Was the killer mocking them?" In the afternoon, Neil walked the grounds, examining the yew trees that lined the drive. Their berries, bright red against the dark foliage, were toxic, he knew. A gardener, an elderly man named Jenkins, confirmed it. "Aye, sir, those berries'll kill you quick. We keep 'em trimmed so the village kids don't get at 'em." "Anyone picking them recently?" Jenkins scratched his head. "Not that I've seen, but the trees are right by the path. Anyone could have nipped in." Neil returned to the house, where the family was dispersing to their separate corners. Percival retreated to the study, poring over more papers. Elaine resumed her knitting, her face pale. Adele, claiming a headache, went to her room, where she secretly dialed Vivian Dubois' number, her voice low as she whispered assurances. Lance, meanwhile, slipped out to the garage, where he tinkered with his car, a sleek convertible he'd bought on credit. His thoughts were not on mechanics, but on the will, which he'd glimpsed in his father's desk. Rex had left the bulk to Adele, with shares for Percival and himself, but his portion was tied to conditions he'd never intended to meet. He lit another cigarette, his jaw tight. Below stairs, the servants' gossip grew fevered. Crump speculated about Adele's fancy man, while Mary Dove silenced them with a sharp look. Gladys, unable to bear it, slipped out to the garden, seeking solace among the rose bushes. The blackbirds watched her, their beady eyes unblinking. She shivered, recalling the rhyme her mother used to sing. 24 blackbirds, baked in a pie. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, Gladys's letter open on her lap. Her nephew Raymond, visiting for tea, raised an eyebrow as she packed a small suitcase. "Off on another adventure, Aunt Jane?" "A little trip to Baden Heath," she said, her voice mild. "A girl in trouble, and a puzzle that sounds all too familiar. Nursery rhymes. Raymond, they're never as innocent as they seem." Back at Yew Tree Lodge, Neil interviewed the minor staff, a footman, a scullery maid, a chauffeur. None offered much beyond confirmation of the household's routines. But the footman, a young man named Tom, mentioned seeing Lance near the yew trees a week ago. "Just standing there, sir, looking at the berries." Thought it odd. Neil's interest sharpened. He confronted Lance later, in the billiard room, where the younger man was idly knocking balls across the green baize. "Mr. Fortescue, you were seen by the yew trees last week. Care to explain?" Lance grinned, unperturbed. "Admiring the scenery, Inspector. Those trees are a landmark here. Didn't touch the berries, if that's what you're thinking." Neil let it go, but the seed of suspicion took root. He spent the evening reviewing the case. Taxine in the tea, rye in the pocket, blackbirds in a pie. The pieces didn't fit, not yet. As night fell, the house grew quiet, save for the patter of rain and the occasional cry of a blackbird. Gladys, in her attic room, wrote another letter to Miss Marple, this one more urgent. "It's worse, miss. They're saying the tea was poisoned. I'm scared I'll be blamed. Please hurry." Adele, in her boudoir, stared at a photograph of herself and Vivian, her mind on the future. Percival, in the study, found a hidden ledger that hinted at Rex's secret dealings. Money funneled to an offshore account. Elaine, overhearing his muttered curses, slipped away to her room, her knitting abandoned. Lance, unable to sleep, wandered the halls, pausing outside his father's study. He thought of the rye, the pie, the rhyme. A plan, half-formed, flickered in his mind. Inspector Neil, in his room at the inn, sketched a diagram of the household, circling names: Adele, Percival, Lance, Vivian, Gladys. Someone knew more than they were saying. And the rhyme. It was the key, he was sure. In the garden, the blackbirds settled for the night, their songs replaced by the rustle of leaves. Yew Tree Lodge held its secrets close, but the echoes of the rhyme were growing louder, promising revelations yet to come. Chapter 4. The Second Verse. The rain had ceased by the third day at Yew Tree Lodge, leaving the air crisp and the lawns glistening under a pale sun. The yew trees stood sentinel, their berries gleaming like drops of blood against the dark foliage, a silent reminder of the poison that had claimed Rex Fortescue. Inside the house, the atmosphere was taut, each member of the household moving with the cautious deliberation of those who know they are watched. The blackbirds, ever present, darted across the garden, their sharp cries punctuating the uneasy quiet. Inspector Neil, fortified by a strong cup of tea at the Baden Heath Arms, returned to the lodge with a renewed sense of purpose. The laboratory reports had confirmed taxine in the tea leaves, and the oddity of the rye grains and blackbird pie lingered in his mind like a half-solved crossword. He had requested the family's presence in the drawing room for further questioning, but first he sought out the cook, Mrs. Crump, in the kitchen, a cavernous space filled with the clatter of pots and the warm scent of baking bread. Mrs. Crump, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and a no-nonsense air, was kneading dough with vigor. She glanced up as Neil entered, her eyes narrowing. "More questions, Inspector? I've told you all I know about that tea." "I'm sure you have," Neil said smoothly, pulling up a stool. "But let's talk about the household routine. Mrs. Fortescue. Adele, does she often take tea in the drawing room?" Mrs. Crump snorted, slamming the dough onto the board. "Every afternoon, like clockwork. Fancies herself a lady, that one. Always wants her Darjeeling served just so, lemon, no milk, and a slice of my Madeira cake on the side." "And who prepares it?" "Gladys, mostly, though I've done it myself when she's off. Mary Dove checks the trays before they go up, likes to keep things proper." Neil nodded, his pen poised over his notebook. "And yesterday afternoon, who handled Mrs. Fortescue's tea?" Mrs. Crump paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Gladys again, Took it up around 4, I think. Mrs. Fortescue was with Mrs. Elaine, chatting about some charity bazaar. Anyone else present? Not that I saw. Mr. Percival was in the study, and Mr. Lance was out. Said he was meeting a friend in the village. Neil thanked her and moved to the drawing room, where the family awaited. The room was bathed in soft light, its chintz curtains drawn back to reveal the sodden garden. Adele sat by the French windows, a delicate teacup in hand, her black dress offset by a single pearl brooch. Percival paced near the fireplace, his face etched with worry, while Elaine sat primly on a sofa, her hands folded in her lap. Lancelot was absent, his whereabouts unaccounted for, which Neil noted with interest. "Mrs. Fortescue," he began, addressing Adele, "I understand you took tea here yesterday afternoon. Can you confirm the time and who was with you?" Adele's eyes flickered with irritation, but her voice was smooth. "About 4 o'clock, Inspector. Elaine was here. We were discussing a local fundraiser. The tea was perfectly ordinary." She hesitated, then added, "Though I did feel a touch unwell afterward. A headache, nothing more." Elaine nodded. "Adele complained of it, but we thought it was the strain. These past days have been dreadful." Neil's gaze sharpened. "Unwell, you say? Can you describe it?" "A throbbing in my temples," Adele said, touching her forehead. "I went to lie down afterward. It passed by evening." The inspector made a note, his mind racing. Taxine was slow-acting. Cyanide, on the other hand, was swift. Could there be another poison at play? He resolved to have Adele's tea service examined. Before he could press further, a commotion erupted from the hall. Mary Dove appeared, her face pale. "Inspector, come quickly. Mrs. Fortescue." Neil followed her to the drawing room's far end, where Adele had risen to pour another cup of tea from a silver pot on a side table. As she lifted the cup to her lips, her face contorted, and she gasped, clutching her chest. The cup fell, shattering on the hardwood floor, the tea spreading in a dark pool. Adele staggered, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, and collapsed onto the chaise longue. "Call the doctor," Neil barked, kneeling beside her. Elaine rushed to the telephone, her hands trembling, while Percival stood frozen, his face ashen. Mary Dove, ever efficient, fetched a glass of water, but Adele's convulsions were already subsiding into an ominous stillness. Dr. Penrose, the local physician, arrived within minutes, his bag rattling with instruments. He examined Adele briefly, his expression grim. "Cyanide," he said quietly, sniffing the air near her lips. "That almond-like smell. Unmistakable. She's gone." Neil's jaw tightened. 2 deaths in 3 days, both by poison. He turned to the side table, where a jar of marmalade stood open, a spoon beside it. Scattered in the sticky residue were grains of rye, glinting in the light. "Rye again," he muttered, his mind flashing to the rhyme. The Queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey. "Secure this room," he ordered Sergeant Hay, who had just arrived. "No one touches that marmalade or the tea service." The family, now gathered in stunned silence, watched as Neela examined the scene. Percival found his voice first. "This is madness, Inspector. First father, now Adele. Who's doing this?" "That's what I intend to find out," Neil said, his tone clipped. "Mrs. Fortescue, did anyone else handle that marmalade?" Elaine shook her head, her eyes wide. "I don't think so. It's Adele's favorite, orange, from Fortnum's. She always kept it in here." Neil's gaze swept the room, landing on the French windows. They were slightly ajar, the damp air seeping in. "Was anyone outside just now?" "No," Mary Dove said firmly. I checked the terrace. Before tea was served, it was empty. The inspector's suspicions deepened. He sent for Gladys, who appeared moments later, her face pale and her apron twisted in her hands. Miss Martin, did you prepare Mrs. Fortescue's tea today? Yes, sir, she whispered. Same as always. I fetched the pot from the kitchen, added the leaves, and brought it here. Mrs. Elaine was with her when I left. And the marmalade. I didn't touch it, sir. It was already on the table. Neil dismissed her, his mind turning to Vivian Dubois. The golf instructor had been mentioned again in the servants' whispers, his visits to Adele a source of gossip. Neil dispatched Hay to summon him from the village. Vivian arrived an hour later, his polished exterior slightly ruffled by the urgency of the call. He stood in the library, his hands in his pockets, exuding an air of calm that bordered on arrogance. Inspector, this is a tragedy. Adele was a dear friend. More than a friend, perhaps? Neil asked, watching him closely. Vivian's smile was tight. I've told you, Inspector, our relationship was professional. I saw her yesterday morning for a lesson, left by noon. I was at the club all afternoon. Ask anyone there. Neil noted the alibi to be verified. Did Mrs. Fortescue seem worried about anything? Threats, perhaps? She was upset about Rex, naturally, said the family was falling apart, but nothing specific. The inspector let him go, his suspicions unsatisfied. He returned to the drawing room where the marmalade jar had been sealed for analysis. The rye grains were a deliberate echo, he was certain. Someone was playing a game, weaving the nursery rhyme into their crimes. Meanwhile, in St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple was boarding a train to Baden Heath, her knitting bag slung over her arm. Gladys's second letter, received that morning, had spurred her into action. Poisoned tea, and now more trouble, she murmured to herself, settling into her seat. It's like that business with the vicar's wife. Everyone looking innocent, but someone always knows more. Back at Yew Tree Lodge, the household was unraveling. Percival, in the study, pored over his father's will, which he'd retrieved from the safe. It left Adele a substantial portion, now void, with the remainder split between himself and Lance, though Lance's share was contingent on rehabilitation. Percival's lips thinned. Lance had never been one for reform. Elaine, in her room, sat by the window, staring at the yew trees. She had liked Adele, in her way, but the woman's extravagance had strained the family's finances. Now, with her gone, the dynamics would shift again. She thought of Percival's late nights, his secretive phone calls. Was he hiding something? Lance, returned from the village, lingered in the garage, his hands stained with motor oil. He'd heard about Adele's death from a barmaid at the Arms, and his mind was racing. The will, the money, the rhyme. It all pointed somewhere. But where? He lit a cigarette, his eyes narrowing. Below stairs, the servants were in disarray. Mrs. Crump wept openly, muttering about curses. Mary Dove, ever composed, directed the staff to prepare a cold supper, her mind on the marmalade jar. Had she missed something in her oversight? Gladys, meanwhile, retreated to her room, her fear mounting. She hadn't told the inspector about the shadow she'd seen in the garden yesterday, moving near the yews. It was too vague, too frightening. Neil, in the dining room, examined the pie again. The stuffed blackbirds, with their lifeless eyes, seemed to mock him. He sent for the gardener, Jenkins, who shuffled in, cap in hand. "Those yew berries," Neil said. "Any chance someone could have harvested them without you noticing?" Jenkins shrugged. "Possible, sir. The trees are right by the path. Anyone could sneak in at dusk." Neil dismissed him and turned to Sergeant Hay. "We need to search the grounds, every shed, every corner, and check the staff's quarters." The search yielded little. A few gardening tools, a sack of rye grain in the shed, likely for the birds, but no trace of cyanide, no obvious clues. Neil's frustration grew, tempered by his determination. The rhyme was the key, he was sure. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye. Rex, the king in his counting house. Adele, the queen in the parlor. Who was next? That evening, the family dined in near silence, the absence of Adele a palpable void. Percival spoke little, his thoughts on the firm's faltering accounts. Elaine picked at her food, her eyes darting to her husband. Lance, unusually subdued, excused himself early, claiming a headache. Gladys, serving the meal, dropped a plate, her nerves frayed. Mary Dove sent her to bed, her tone sharp but not unkind. In her room, Gladys clutched Miss Marple's first reply. Arrived that day. "I am coming, dear. Stay calm and observe." It was a lifeline, but the fear remained. Neil, at the inn, pored over his notes. The anonymous letters, the mine deal, the family tensions, all pointed to motive, but the method eluded him. Cyanide was easier to obtain than taxine, but still required planning. He sketched a timeline. Rex's death at breakfast, Adele's at tea. The killer was bold, striking in daylight. In the village, Vivian Dubois dined alone, his thoughts on Adele. She'd been reckless, he knew, but he'd cared for her. Had she known too much? He pushed the thought aside, focusing on his alibi. At Yew Tree Lodge, the night deepened, the blackbirds silent under the stars. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next verse of the rhyme to unfold. Neil, sleepless, stared at the ceiling, the words echoing. 24 blackbirds, baked in a pie. Somewhere in that childish song lay the truth, and he would find it. Chapter 5. Miss Marple arrives. The train from St. Mary. Meade pulled into Baden Heath Station just as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the sleepy village. The platform was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of blackbirds perched in a nearby hedgerow. Miss Jane Marple stepped down from the carriage, her small suitcase in one hand and her knitting bag slung over her arm. She wore a sensible tweed coat, a neat hat adorned with a single feather, and an expression of mild curiosity that belied the sharpness of her mind. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster on a visit, but those who knew her understood that her arrival often heralded the unraveling of secrets. Miss Marple paused to adjust her gloves, her blue eyes scanning the station. She had received Gladys Martin's second letter that morning, its urgent tone confirming her decision to come. Poisoned tea, and now another death, she murmured to herself, recalling the details. It's like that dreadful affair at Much Deeping. Everyone so polite, yet someone with murder in their heart. A local taxi, driven by a grizzled man named Harris, awaited her. "Yew Tree Lodge, miss?" he asked, tipping his cap. "Heard there's trouble up there, folks dropping like flies." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So, I understand, Mr. Harris, but let's not jump to conclusions. A village is full of stories, isn't it?" Harris grunted, stowing her suitcase. "Aye, and some stories are truer than you'd like." The drive to Yew Tree Lodge wound through lanes lined with hawthorn and elder, the fields beyond dotted with grazing sheep. Miss Marple gazed out, her thoughts on Gladys. The girl had always been nervous. but her letters betrayed a deeper fear, something specific, perhaps, that she hadn't dared put to paper. The mention of nursery rhymes intrigued Miss Marple most. "Sing a song of sixpence," she mused. "A pocket full of rye, a pie of blackbirds, a queen in the parlor. It's all so theatrical, like a play put on to distract." At Yew Tree Lodge, Inspector Neal was grappling with the mounting complexities of the case. The laboratory had confirmed cyanide in the marmalade, and the rye grains found with Adele's body echoed those in Rex Fortescue's pocket. The nursery rhyme was no coincidence, he was certain, but its purpose eluded him. Was it a signature, a taunt, or a misdirection? He stood now in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids, questioning Mary Dove about the household's movements on the day of Adele's death. "Mrs. Fortescue's tea tray," Neal said, his notebook open. "You checked it before it went up?" Mary Dove nodded, her hands folded neatly in front of her black dress. "As always, Inspector. I ensure everything is in order. Pot, cup, saucer, lemon slices. The marmalade jar was already in the drawing room, per Mrs. Fortescue's habit." "And you saw no one tampering with it?" "No one. The room was empty when I placed the tray. Mrs. Elaine arrived shortly after, then Gladys brought the tea." Neal's eyes narrowed. "And Mr. Lancelot, where was he?" "Out, I believe. He mentioned a meeting in the village, returned just before dinner." The inspector thanked her and moved to the garden, where he examined the yew trees again. The berries, bright and deadly, hung in clusters, easily accessible to anyone with intent. He had ordered a thorough search of the grounds, but nothing new had emerged. No vials, no traces of cyanide beyond the marmalade. The killer was meticulous, leaving only the rhyme as a clue. Inside, the household was in a state of subdued panic. Percival Fortescue, barricaded in his father's study, sifted through financial records, his face drawn. The firm, Consolidated Investments, was teetering, its losses tied to Rex's speculative ventures, particularly the Blackbird mine, a venture that had promised riches but delivered only debts. Percival's fingers trembled as he uncovered a coded note in his father's handwriting, hinting at a secret account. He tucked it away, his mind racing. Could it be connected to the murders? Elaine, in the morning room, sat with a cup of untouched tea, her thoughts on Adele. The woman's death had shocked her, not least because it shifted the family's dynamics. With Adele gone, the estate would be divided differently, but Percival's secrecy worried her. She had overheard him on the telephone last night, his voice low and urgent, speaking of covering the shortfall. What shortfall? Lancelot, meanwhile, was in the billiard room, idly spinning a cue stick as he considered his next move. Adele's death had been unexpected, but it simplified things. The will, he knew, favored him less than Percival. But with Adele out of the picture, his share might increase. He thought of the rye grains, the blackbirds, the rhyme. Someone was clever. Too clever, perhaps. He smiled faintly, his mind on a plan he hadn't yet fully formed. Miss Marple's arrival at Yew Tree Lodge caused a ripple of surprise among the staff. Mary Dove, greeting her at the door, raised an eyebrow. "Miss Martin's guest, I presume?" She mentioned an old friend from St. Mary Mead. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp. "Gladys was kind enough to invite me. Such a troubled household, from what I hear." Mary Dove's lips twitched, but she said nothing, leading Miss Marple to a small guest room on the second floor. The room was modest, with a single bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the garden where blackbirds flitted among the roses. Miss Marple unpacked her knitting, her mind already cataloging the house's rhythms, the creak of floorboards, the distant clatter from the kitchen, the muffled voices of the family. She sought out Gladys at once, finding her in the servants' hall, polishing silver with trembling hands. The girl's face lit up with relief. "Oh, Miss Marple, you came?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "Now, tell me everything, but quietly. Walls have ears, you know." Gladys glanced nervously at the door, then lowered her voice. "It's awful, miss. First Mr. Fortescue, then Mrs. Fortescue. Poison, both of 'em. And I made the tea both times. They're looking at me funny, the others. I'm scared I'll be blamed." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "You mustn't fret, Gladys. Tell me, what did you see? Anything odd? Anything out of place?" Gladys hesitated, twisting her apron. "There was a shadow, miss. In the garden, by the yews, the day Mrs. Fortescue died. I was fetching herbs for cook, and I saw someone moving, quick, like they didn't want to be seen. But it was dusk, and I couldn't make out who." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she began a new row of knitting. "A shadow, you say? Very interesting. And the marmalade. Did you notice anything about it?" "No, miss. It was just there, on the table. Mrs. Fortescue always had it with her tea." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Think carefully, dear. Anyone lingering near the drawing room before the tea was served?" Gladys frowned, her memory straining. "Mr. Lance was in and out that day. Said he was fixing his car, but he came through the hall once, near the drawing-room door. I didn't think nothing of it." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Very well. Keep your eyes open, Gladys, but don't speak of this to anyone else. Not yet." As Gladys returned to her work, Miss Marple settled by the window, her knitting a pretext for observation. The garden was a maze of paths and hedges, the yew trees looming at its edge. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, a poisoned jar of chutney slipped into a pantry by a jealous cousin. The method here was bolder, the rhyme a flourish that suggested confidence, perhaps arrogance. She ventured downstairs, introducing herself to Inspector Neal in the library. He was a man of middle age, with a steady gaze and a manner that suggested patience tempered by determination. "Miss Marple," he said, rising. "Gladys mentioned you. I confess I'm surprised. A friend from her village days?" "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I've a habit of noticing things, Inspector. Small things, the kind people overlook, like nursery rhymes, for instance. They can hide such dark intentions." Neil's interest sharpened. "You've heard about the rhyme, then? The rye, the blackbirds, the marmalade?" "Oh, yes. Gladys wrote to me. It's curious, isn't it? Sing a song of sixpence. Rex Fortescue as the king, counting his money. Adele as the queen, eating her bread and honey. The rhyme seems to guide the killer's hand." Neil leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "You think it's deliberate?" "Very much so," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "It's like a game, Inspector. Someone wants us to notice the pattern, but not the purpose. In my village, we had a young man who left riddles to cover his thefts, distracted everyone until the truth came out." Neil made a note. "Any theories on who might be playing this game?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not yet, Inspector, but I'd look closely at those who stand to gain, and those who know the house best. Servants see everything, you know." She excused herself, leaving Neela to ponder her words. He summoned Percival next, finding him in the study, surrounded by papers. "Mr. Fortescue, your father's will. Have you reviewed it?" Percival's face tightened. "Yes. It leaves a portion to Adele, now void, and the rest split between Lance and me. Mine's straightforward. Lance's has conditions." "Conditions?" "He must prove himself reformed." Father's words. "Lance hasn't a hope of that." Neil noted the bitterness in his tone. "And the firm? Any financial troubles?" Percival hesitated. "Some setbacks. The Blackbird mine was a disaster, but we'll manage." The inspector moved on to Elaine, who was in the morning room arranging flowers. She was pale, her hands unsteady. "Mrs. Fortescue, you were with Adele when she took tea. Did she mention anything unusual?" Elaine shook her head. "Just the headache. She was upset about Rex, of course. And she mentioned Vivian Dubois, said he'd been kind to her." Neil's interest piqued. He sought out Lance, who was polishing his car in the garage, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Mr. Fortescue, you were in the village yesterday. Can anyone confirm that?" Lance grinned. "The barmaid at the Arms, Jenny, her name is, chatted with her for an hour. Then I stopped by the post office." "And your thoughts on Adele's death?" "A shock," Lance said, his tone casual. "But she was reckless, probably made enemies like father." Neil let him go, his suspicions swirling. He returned to the drawing room where Miss Marple had joined Elaine, her knitting a constant companion. "Such a lovely room," she remarked. "But those French windows, do they lock securely?" Elaine frowned. "I believe so. Mary Dove checks them nightly." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the garden. "A pity about the yews. So beautiful, yet so dangerous." That evening, Miss Marple dined with the family, her presence a curiosity. Percival was polite but distracted, Elaine nervous, Lance charmingly attentive. "You must find our troubles fascinating, Miss Marple," he said, passing her the potatoes. "Oh, I'm just a visitor," she replied, her smile bland. "But I do notice things, like how families can be so close, yet so far apart." Lance's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to her room, where she sat by the window, knitting and thinking. The rhyme was a puzzle, but puzzles had solutions. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead's scandal, a forged will hidden in plain sight. Was the rhyme hiding something equally obvious? Neil, at the inn, reviewed his notes. The coded note Percival hadn't mentioned intrigued him. He'd have it analyzed tomorrow. Meanwhile, Vivian Dubois' alibi checked out. Too neatly, perhaps. And Gladys's fear. Did she know more than she'd said? In her attic room, Gladys clutched Miss Marple's latest letter, promising help. She hadn't told the inspector about the faint scent of almonds she'd noticed in the drawing room, fearing it would implicate her further. She resolved to tell Miss Marple tomorrow. The night deepened, the blackbirds silent in their roosts. Yew Tree Lodge was a house of shadows, each occupant guarding their own secrets. Miss Marple, her needles still, gazed at the stars, her mind piecing together the threads of a deadly rhyme. Chapter 6. The Maid in the Garden. The fourth day at Yew Tree Lodge dawned with a deceptive calm, the sky a pale wash of blue streaked with wispy clouds. The yew trees, their branches still damp from the recent rain, cast long shadows across the garden, where the blackbirds resumed their restless dance among the rose bushes. Inside the house, the air was thick with dread, the double tragedy of Rex and Adele. Fortescue's deaths weighing on every occupant. The nursery rhyme, with its sinister echoes, seemed to lurk in every corner, its verses a taunting reminder of the killer's audacity. Miss Jane Marple, settled in her modest guest room, sipped a cup of weak tea brought by a trembling Gladys Martin. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed, her nervous energy palpable as she hovered near the door. "I'm that glad you're here, miss," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "It's like a curse, with the master and mistress gone." Miss Marple set her cup down, her expression gentle, but her gaze piercing. "No curse, Gladys, only human wickedness. Now, tell me more about that shadow you saw in the garden. Every detail, dear." Gladys twisted her hands, her voice barely audible. "It was just before dusk, the day Mrs. Fortescue died. I was out by the herb patch, picking parsley for cook. I saw something moving by the yew hedge. Not clear-like, but tallish, moving quick. I thought it was Jenkins, the gardener, but he was in the shed," he said later. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, a soothing counterpoint to the girl's agitation. "And you told no one else?" "No, miss. I was afraid they'd think I was making it up, or worse, that it'd point to me." "You did right to tell me," Miss Marple said, her mind turning to a case in St. Mary Mead, where a furtive figure in a churchyard had led to a stolen will. "Keep watching, Gladys, but be careful. Someone in this house is dangerous." As Gladys slipped away, Miss Marple gazed out her window, her thoughts on the rhyme. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes. The line sent a shiver through her. She resolved to keep a close eye on the girl. Inspector Neal, meanwhile, was in the library, poring over the coded note found in Rex's desk. It was a cryptic scrawl mentioning blackbird dividends and a numbered account in Zurich. He had sent it to Scotland Yard for analysis, suspecting it tied to the firm's financial troubles. The Blackbird mine, he knew, was a sore point. Percival had admitted it was bleeding money, and Lance had been involved in its early days before his exile. Could it be motive? He summoned Mary Dove, who entered with her usual composure, her dark eyes assessing. "Miss Dove, you've seen the family's comings and goings. Any unusual behavior since Mrs. Fortescue's death?" Mary hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Mr. Percival's been shut up in the study, going through papers. He's worried, I'd say, more than he lets on. Mrs. Elaine's been quieter than usual, keeping to her room. And Mr. Lance, he's been restless, always out in the garage or walking the grounds. And visitors. Mr. Dubois, for instance? He hasn't been back since yesterday. Mrs. Fortescue's death shook him. I think he sent flowers this morning, white lilies." Neal made a note. "And the servants, any gossip?" Mary's lips twitched. "They're frightened, Inspector. Crump's talking of curses, and Gladys is jumpy as a cat. She's been dropping things, making mistakes." Neal thanked her and moved to the garden, where he met Jenkins, the gardener, raking leaves. "Mr. Jenkins, you said no one's been near the yew-berries, but could someone have slipped in unnoticed?" Jenkins scratched his chin, his weathered face creased. "At dusk, maybe. The path's open to the lane. Folks walk by sometimes. I locked the shed, but the trees are right there." Neal nodded, his eyes scanning the hedge where Gladys had seen her shadow. He resolved to set a watch on the grounds tonight. Inside, the family was scattered, each grappling with the new reality. Percival, in the study, uncovered another troubling document, a letter from a creditor demanding immediate payment for a loan tied to the Blackbird mine. He cursed under his breath, his hands shaking. The firm was on the brink, and Adele's death, while simplifying the will, hadn't solved the financial mess. He thought of Lance, whose return had coincided with disaster. Was it coincidence? Elaine, in the morning room, was writing a letter to her sister, her pen faltering as she described the horrors. She had always been the steady one, supporting Percival through his father's domineering ways. But now doubt gnawed at her. She had seen him slip a paper into his pocket last night, his face guarded. What was he hiding? Lance, in the garage, polished his car with unnecessary vigor, his thoughts on the murders. He had no love for Adele, but her death was inconvenient. It drew too much attention. The rhyme, though, intrigued him. Someone was clever, staging the deaths like scenes in a play. He wondered if he could turn it to his advantage. Miss Marple, meanwhile, joined the family for luncheon, her presence a quiet anomaly. The dining room was somber, the long table set with silver and crystal that seemed out of place amid the grief. Percival sat at the head, his manner stiff, while Elaine served soup with a trembling hand. Lance, arriving late, flashed a charming smile. "Miss Marple, you're a breath of fresh air in this gloomy house." "Oh, I'm just an old woman who likes to listen," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "You've been abroad. Mr. Fortescue, tell me, what's Africa like?" Lance launched into a tale of diamond mines and desert nights, his voice animated. Miss Marple listened, noting the way. His eyes flickered when he mentioned his father's disapproval. "He never understood ambition," Lance said, his tone light but edged. "Thought I'd squander everything?" Percival's spoon clattered against his bowl. "You did, Lance. That's why he sent you away." Elaine flushed, her voice soft. "Please, not now." Miss Marple changed the subject, asking about the garden. "Those yew trees are striking, but dangerous, I hear. Do you ever use the berries for anything?" The table fell silent. Percival cleared his throat. "No, Miss Marple. They're poisonous. Jenkins keeps them trimmed." "Of course," she said, her smile bland. But her mind was racing. Someone had used those berries. And recently. After luncheon, Miss Marple wandered the garden, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. She paused by the yew hedge, examining the ground for signs of disturbance. A few crushed berries lay scattered, but it could have been the wind, or a careless foot. She thought of Gladys's shadow, her mind conjuring a figure slipping through the dusk. Inspector Neal, meanwhile, received a call from Scotland Yard. The coded note pointed to a Swiss account, but the funds were locked, accessible only with a second signature. Rex's, now impossible. Neal's suspicions turned to Percival, who had access to the firm's records. He confronted him in the study. "Mr. Fortescue, this account, did you know about it?" Percival's face paled. "I suspected father had private dealings. He was secretive, even with me." "And the Blackbird mine? Was it tied to this?" "Possibly," Percival admitted. "It was a gamble that went wrong. I tried to warn him." Neal left, unsatisfied. He sought out Vivian Dubois, who was at the golf club, practicing swings with a studied calm. "Mr. Dubois, you were close to Mrs. Fortescue. Did she ever mention financial troubles?" Vivian's eyes narrowed. "She hinted at it, said Rex was under pressure, but she didn't know details. I told her to stay out of it. Business wasn't her forte." Neal pressed further. "And your visits to the house? Any enemies you noticed?" "None," Vivian said smoothly. "But Rex had a way of making them. He was ruthless in deals." As evening approached, Miss Marple sat with Gladys in the servants' hall, the girl's fear palpable. "I smelled something, miss," Gladys confessed, her voice a whisper. In the drawing room, after Mrs. Fortescue died, like almonds, only bitter. Miss Marple's eyes widened. Cyanide, perhaps? You must tell the inspector, dear, but carefully. Say you noticed it when clearing the tray. Gladys nodded, her resolve strengthening. But as she rose to return to her duties, a sudden impulse sent her to the garden, seeking fresh air. The dusk was settling, the sky a deep violet, and the blackbirds were silent. She walked toward the herb patch, her heart pounding. A rustle in the yew hedge made her freeze. Before she could turn, a shadow loomed, and a cord tightened around her throat. She gasped, clawing at it, but her strength faded fast. As she sank to the ground, a clothes peg was placed on her nose, a grotesque echo of the rhyme. When down came a blackbird and pecked off her nose. Her scream, brief and piercing, cut through the evening, bringing Jenkins running from the shed. He found her body, the peg, a stark detail in the fading light. "Murder!" he shouted, his voice carrying to the house. Neil, in the library, heard the cry and raced outside, followed by Percival and Lance. Elaine, in her room, froze, her hands trembling. Miss Marple, at her window, saw the commotion and hurried down, her knitting abandoned. The scene was grim. Gladys sprawled in the grass, her eyes wide with shock. Neil knelt beside her, his face grim. "Strangled," he said, noting the peg. And the rhyme again. Damn it. He ordered the garden cordoned off and summoned the family. Percival was in the study, he said, working late. Elaine had been in her room, resting. Lance claimed a walk by the lake. Alone. Vivian Dubois, questioned later, was at the club, his alibi confirmed by the barman. Miss Marple, standing quietly to the side, observed the family's reactions. Percival's shock seemed genuine, but his eyes darted nervously. Elaine wept softly, her hands clasped. Lance's face was unreadable, his cigarette glowing in the dark. "Poor Gladys," Miss Marple said softly to Neil. "She knew something, didn't she? That shadow in the garden. She saw the killer." Neil nodded, his jaw tight. "But what? And why the peg?" "The rhyme," Miss Marple said. "It's a pattern, Inspector. The maid in the garden, just as it says. Someone is following it to the letter." That night, the house was a fortress of tension. Percival locked himself in the study, his thoughts on the Swiss account. Elaine, unable to sleep, paced her room, her mind on Gladys's kindness. Lance, in his room, stared at a map of Africa, his plans shifting. Miss Marple, in her room, knitted furiously, her mind racing. The rhyme was a mask, she was sure, hiding a simpler motive. Money, revenge, perhaps both. She thought of a saint. Mary Mead murder, where a servant's death had been the key to a family's greed. Gladys saw too much, she murmured. But what? Neil, at the inn, sketched a new diagram, adding Gladys's name. The rhyme was a thread, but the motive lay in the family, or someone close. He resolved to dig deeper into the blackbird mine and the mysterious account. In the garden, the blackbirds stirred, their cries faint in the night. Yew Tree Lodge was a house of death, its secrets buried deep, but Miss Marple and Inspector Neil were closing in, guided by the sinister rhythm of a nursery rhyme. Chapter 7. Unraveling Threads. The morning after Gladys Martin's death broke over Yew Tree Lodge with a heavy stillness, as if the house itself mourned the loss of its humblest occupant. The sky was overcast, a gray pall that mirrored the mood within. The blackbirds, usually so vocal, were subdued, their occasional chirps swallowed by the damp air. The garden, where Gladys had met her tragic end, was cordoned off with tape, a stark reminder of the violence that had crept into this once orderly household. Inside, the remaining occupants moved like shadows, their voices hushed, their glances wary. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, her knitting needles idle for once, her mind racing over the events of the past days. The death of Gladys had struck her deeply, not just for its brutality, but for its precision. The clothes peg on the girl's nose, a grotesque nod to the nursery rhyme, confirmed her suspicion that the killer was following a script, each murder a carefully staged act. "Sing a song of sixpence," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. The king, the queen, the maid, all gone. But why? And who is next? She thought of a saint, Mary Mead case, where a series of seemingly random thefts had masked a deeper crime. Here the rhyme was the mask, but the motive remained elusive. Inspector Neal, stationed in the library, was equally troubled. The murder of Gladys had escalated the case, transforming it from a family tragedy into a pattern of chilling calculation. He had spent the night reviewing evidence, the taxine in Rex's tea, the cyanide in Adele's marmalade, and now the strangulation of Gladys, marked by that mocking peg. The rhyme tied them together, but the method, poison to strangulation, suggested either desperation or a shift in strategy. He sent for Sergeant Hay, who arrived with a preliminary report from the coroner. "Strangled with a thin cord, sir," Hay said, his voice grim. "Likely a scarf or rope, something common. No fingerprints on the peg. Wiped clean." Neal nodded, his jaw tight. "And the grounds? Any new findings?" "Nothing yet, sir. The yew hedge was trampled near where she was found, but it could have been Jenkins or the police. We're still searching for the cord." Neal dismissed him and turned to his notes. The Blackbird mine loomed large, a failed venture that had drained the family's coffers. The coded note about a Swiss account suggested Rex had hidden assets, perhaps to shield them from creditors. Percival's evasiveness about the firm's finances was troubling, and Lance's return, timed so neatly with the murders, raised questions. Vivian Dubois, too, remained a puzzle. His alibis were solid, but his connection to Adele hinted at deeper involvement. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sought out Mary Dove in the conservatory, where the housekeeper was pruning a wilting orchid with meticulous care. "A terrible thing about poor Gladys," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "She was so frightened, wasn't she?" Mary's shears paused, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "She was, Miss Marple, kept to herself these last days, always looking over her shoulder. I thought it was just nerves, with the police about." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting resumed as a pretext for conversation. "Servants notice things, Miss Dove. Did Gladys ever mention anything odd? Someone lurking, perhaps?" Mary hesitated, then snipped another leaf. "She did say something about the garden. Saw a figure by the yews," she said. "I told her it was probably Jenkins, but she wasn't convinced." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. "And you? Have you noticed anything unusual in the household?" Mary's lips tightened. "Mr. Lance has been restless, always in and out, talking of his adventures. Mr. Percival's been buried in papers, more than usual. And Mrs. Elaine, she's been quiet. But I saw her burning a letter in the fireplace yesterday." Miss Marple filed the detail away, her mind on a St. Mary Mead widow who had burned love letters to hide an affair. "Thank you, Miss Dove. You've a sharp eye." She moved to the drawing room, where Elaine Fortescue sat alone, staring at a photograph of herself and Percival on their wedding day. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple settled beside her, her knitting a comforting presence. "Mrs. Fortescue, this must be a dreadful time. You were fond of Gladys, weren't you?" Elaine's hands trembled. "She was kind, Miss Marple, always willing to help. I can't believe she's gone." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It's often the innocent who suffer in such cases. Tell me, did you notice anything strange about her yesterday?" Elaine hesitated, then spoke softly. "She was nervous, dropping things. She said something about the garden, said it gave her the creeps after dark. I told her to stay indoors." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Wise advice. And your husband? Has he been himself?" Elaine's gaze flickered. "Percival's preoccupied. The firm's in trouble, I know that much. He won't tell me everything." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Men do like their secrets, don't they? But they often come to light." Inspector Neal, meanwhile, summoned Percival to the library. The elder son entered, his face drawn, his suit rumpled from sleepless nights. "Mr. Fortescue," Neal began, "we found a coded note in your father's desk mentioning a Swiss account. What do you know about it?" Percival's eyes widened, then narrowed. "I told you, Inspector. Father kept some dealings private. I knew of the account, but not its purpose. He was cautious, that's all." "And the Blackbird mine. You said it was a disaster. Any enemies from that venture?" Percival shifted uncomfortably. "There were investors who lost money. A man named Mackenzie was particularly bitter, sent threatening letters years ago, but he's long gone." Neal made a note to trace Mackenzie. "And your brother, Lancelot. He was involved in the mine before his exile?" "Yes," Percival said, his voice tight. "He pushed Father to invest, then botched the deal. That's why he was sent away." Neal let him go, his suspicions deepening. He sought out Lance next, finding him in the garage, tinkering with his car's engine. The younger Fortescue looked up, his smile easy, but his eyes guarded. "Another round of questions, Inspector?" "Your whereabouts last evening, Mr. Fortescue, when Gladys was killed?" Lance wiped his hands on a rag. "By the lake, as I said. Needed to clear my head. No one saw me, I'm afraid. Solitary walk." "And your thoughts on Gladys's death?" "A shame," Lance said, lighting a cigarette. "She was a sweet girl, but jumpy. Probably saw something she shouldn't have." Neal's gaze sharpened. "Such as?" Lance shrugged. "Who knows? Servants hear things, don't they?" The inspector left, his mind on the clothes peg. It was a deliberate touch, meant to draw attention to the rhyme. He returned to the garden, where Jenkins was clearing debris near the yew hedge. "Any new visitors to the grounds yesterday?" Neal asked. Jenkins shook his head. "None, sir, but I found this near the hedge this morning." He held out a scrap of fabric, dark blue, finely woven, torn at the edge. Neal bagged it for analysis, his thoughts racing. A scarf, perhaps? The murder weapon? Miss Marple, meanwhile, visited the village, ostensibly to post a letter, but in truth to gauge the local gossip. At the post office, she chatted with the postmistress, Mrs. Price, a woman with a keen ear for scandal. "Terrible doings at the lodge," Mrs. Price said, leaning over the counter. "They say the maid was strangled, with a peg on her nose, like that old rhyme." Miss Marple nodded, her expression bland. "Curious, isn't it? Have you heard anything about the family? Visitors, perhaps?" Mrs. Price lowered her voice. "That Mr. Dubois, the golf man, he's been seen with Mrs. Fortescue before she died, and Mr. Lance always flashing his smile at the pub. Folks say he's after the money." Miss Marple thanked her and returned to the lodge, her mind on Dubois. She found him in the village at the Baden Heath Arms, sipping coffee in the lounge. "Mr. Dubois," she said, settling across from him, "you must be shaken by these events." Vivian's smile was strained. "It's horrific, Miss Marple. Adele was a friend, and now the maid. I barely knew her, but it's dreadful." "You visited often," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "Did you ever notice anything odd in the household?" Vivian hesitated. Adele was worried about Rex's business, said he'd made enemies, but she didn't elaborate. Miss Marple's needles clicked. "And Mr. Lancelot? He's a charming young man, isn't he?" Vivian's eyes flickered. "Too charming, perhaps, always talking of his adventures, but there's a hardness to him." She thanked him and returned to the lodge, her suspicions growing. She joined Neela in the library, sharing her observations. "Inspector, have you considered the rhyme's purpose? It's not just a signature, it's a distraction, like a conjurer's trick." Neil nodded, intrigued. "You think the killer wants us chasing the rhyme, not the motive?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "In my village, a thief used riddles to keep us looking the wrong way. Here, it's money or revenge, I'd wager. The Blackbird mine seems central." Neil shared the coded notes details, and Miss Marple's eyes lit up. "A hidden account? That's motive enough for murder. Someone wanted it locked away, or accessible." That evening, the household dined in near silence, the absence of Gladys keenly felt. Percival barely spoke, his thoughts on the creditor's letter. Elaine, pale and withdrawn, pushed her food around her plate. Lance, unusually quiet, excused himself early, citing a headache. Miss Marple, observing from her seat, noted the tension. She retired to her room, where she sat by the window, knitting and thinking. The scrap of fabric intrigued her, blue, like the scarf Lance often wore. But it was too soon to accuse. Neil, at the inn, received a call from Scotland Yard. The fabric matched a high-end wool, common in men's scarves. No fingerprints, but it was a lead. He resolved to question Lance again. In the night, Yew Tree Lodge was quiet, save for the creak of floorboards and the distant cry of a blackbird. Miss Marple, sleepless, pieced together the puzzle. The rhyme was a mask, but the threads were unraveling, and the truth was close. Chapter 8. Red Herrings and Revelations. The fifth day at Yew Tree Lodge brought a brittle clarity to the air, the clouds parting to reveal a sky of piercing blue. The yew trees stood stark against the horizon, their berries glistening in the morning light, a silent testament to the poison that had sparked this grim chain of events. The garden, still cordoned off where Gladys Martin had met her end, seemed to pulse with an unspoken menace, the blackbirds weaving through shrubs with an almost mocking indifference. Inside, the house was a crucible of tension, each occupant navigating the weight of suspicion and loss with varying degrees of composure. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her guest room with a cup of tea gone cold, was piecing together the fragments of the case. Her knitting lay untouched, her mind too occupied with the sinister pattern of the murders. Rex Fortescue, poisoned with taxine. Adele, felled by cyanide. And now Gladys, strangled with a clothes peg placed on her nose, a grotesque echo of the nursery rhyme. "Sing a song of sixpence," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. "It's a performance, meant to dazzle and distract. But from what?" She thought of a saint, Mary Mead intrigue, where a series of petty thefts had concealed a larger fraud. Here the rhyme was a flourish, but The motive, money, power, revenge, was surely simpler. Inspector Neal, stationed in the dining room, was grappling with a similar puzzle. The scrap of blue wool found near the yew hedge had been identified as high-quality cashmere, likely from a scarf, but no match had been found in the house. The coded note about the Swiss account had yielded little. The bank refused to disclose details without Rex's signature, now impossible. The Blackbird mine, however, was proving a fertile ground for inquiry. Scotland Yard had traced a series of angry letters from a Mr. Mackenzie, a disgruntled investor, though he had vanished years ago. Neal's instincts told him the motive lay closer to home, within the fractured family. He summoned Mary Dove to the dining room, where the remnants of the blackbird pie still sat under a glass dome, its stuffed occupants a macabre centerpiece. "Miss Dove," he began, his tone measured, "you've been forthright about the household's routines. But let's talk about Gladys. Did she confide anything to you before her death?" Mary's expression remained composed, though her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. "She was frightened, Inspector, as I've said. Kept muttering about the garden, the yews. She thought someone was watching her, but I put it down to nerves. And her duties? Did she have access to anything unusual? Poisons, perhaps?" Mary shook her head. "The kitchen's clean, sir. No cyanide, no taxine. The yew berries are outside, and Gladys wasn't one for gardening." Neal nodded, his eyes drifting to the pie. "This pie, Mr. Fortescue's idea, you said. Did anyone else show interest in it?" "Mr. Lance commented on it," Mary replied. "Said it was a clever touch, like something from a story. He laughed, but it was odd." Neal made a note, his suspicions sharpening. He thanked her and moved to the study, where Percival Fortescue was sorting through a stack of ledgers, his face etched with exhaustion. "Mr. Fortescue," Neal said, "we've traced some of your father's dealings to a failed mine venture. You mentioned a Mr. Mackenzie. Any chance he's still a threat?" Percival's pen paused, his eyes flickering with unease. "Mackenzie? No, Inspector. He was a loudmouth who lost money and blamed father. He disappeared after threatening a lawsuit. I doubt he's involved." "And your brother's role in the mine? He was part of it, wasn't he?" Percival's jaw tightened. "Lance pushed the deal, yes. Father trusted him, and it cost us dearly. That's why he was sent to Africa, to keep him out of trouble." Neal leaned forward. "And now he's back. Convenient timing, don't you think?" Percival's gaze hardened. "Lance is reckless, Inspector, but he's no murderer. He'd rather charm his way to money than kill for it." Neal let him go, his mind turning to Lancelot. He found the younger Fortescue in the billiard room, practicing shots with a casual air that belied the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Fortescue," Neal said, "you were involved in the Blackbird mine before your exile. Any lingering grudges from that?" Lance's cue paused, his smile wry. "Grudges? Plenty, Inspector. Investors lost fortunes, and I took the blame. But that was years ago. I've moved on." "And your walk by the lake the night Gladys died. Any witnesses?" Lance's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained light. "Just the stars, I'm afraid. I like my own company." Neal pressed further. "And this pie, the blackbird pie. You commented on it, I hear. Found it amusing?" Lance chuckled. "A bit of whimsy in a grim house. Father had a strange sense of humor. Thought it'd liven up dinner." The inspector left, unsatisfied. Lance's charm was a shield, but what lay behind it? He resolved to check his alibi more thoroughly. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was in the village, visiting the vicarage to consult with the Reverend Mr. Thompson, a kindly man with a penchant for local history. She found him in his study, surrounded by dusty tomes. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "what brings you to our troubled parish?" "A sad affair at Yew Tree Lodge," she replied, settling into a chair. "I'm helping a friend, you see. Tell me, Reverend, do you know anything of nursery rhymes? Sing a song of sixpence, for instance?" The vicar's eyes lit up. "Oh, yes, an old rhyme, full of hidden meanings. Some say it's about medieval feasts, others about political plots. The blackbirds, the rye, it's all symbolic, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind on a saint. Mary Mead case, where a coded message in a hymn book had revealed a smuggling ring. Symbolic indeed. And the Fortescues, any talk of their past? The vicar hesitated. Rex Fortescue was a hard man, made his fortune ruthlessly. There was a scandal years ago, something about a mine in Africa. Lancelot was involved, sent away after it collapsed. The village still whispers about it. Miss Marple thanked him and returned to the lodge, her thoughts on Lance. She found Elaine Fortescue in the morning room, arranging a vase of dahlias with unsteady hands. "Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, "you've been under such strain. Have you noticed anything odd about the household? Letters, perhaps, or visitors?" Elaine's fingers faltered, a petal falling to the table. "Letters? I burned one yesterday, Miss Marple. It was nothing, just a note from a friend, personal." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Of course, dear, but secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they?" Elaine flushed, turning away. Miss Marple moved to the conservatory, where she found Mary Dove polishing a glass pane. "Miss Dove," she said, "you mentioned Mrs. Elaine burning a letter. Did you see what it was?" Mary's expression tightened. "I didn't read it, Miss Marple, but it was handwritten on blue paper. She was quick to burn it, like she didn't want it seen." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. She returned to her room, where she sat by the window. Her knitting resumed as she pondered. The blue scarf, the blue paper, coincidences or connections. She thought of Lance's charm, Percival's secrecy, Elaine's nervousness. Someone was weaving a web, and the rhyme was its thread. Inspector Neal, meanwhile, received a report from Scotland Yard. The blue cashmere matched a scarf sold at a London shop, but no one in the household admitted to owning one. He confronted Lance again, this time in the garage, where the younger man was tinkering with his car's carburetor. "Mr. Fortescue, do you own a blue cashmere scarf?" Lance's hands paused, his smile tight. "A scarf? I've got a few, Inspector. Blue's a common color. Want to search my wardrobe?" Neal declined, but his suspicions deepened. He moved to question Elaine, finding her in the drawing room, staring out at the garden. "Mrs. Fortescue, you burned a letter yesterday. What was it?" Elaine's face paled. "It was nothing, Inspector. A personal note. I didn't want Percival to see it." "From whom?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Vivian Dubois. He wrote to offer condolences. It was harmless, but Percival's jealous." Neal made a note, his mind on Dubois. He sought the golf instructor at the club, where he was giving a lesson to a local squire. "Mr. Dubois," Neal said, "you wrote to Mrs. Elaine?" Vivian's expression flickered. "A note of sympathy, Inspector. She was close to Adele. I meant no harm." "And your relationship with Mrs. Adele Fortescue, was it truly professional?" Vivian's eyes hardened. "I loved her, Inspector, if you must know, but I didn't kill her, or anyone else." Neal let him go, his thoughts swirling. Elaine's letter, Dubois's admission. Red herrings or clues? He returned to the lodge, where Miss Marple was sipping tea in the drawing room, her knitting a constant companion. "Inspector," she said, "have you considered the servants' quarters?" Gladys might have left something, a note, a clue. Neil nodded, impressed by her insight. He ordered a search of Gladys's room, finding a small diary tucked under her mattress. Its pages were filled with anxious scrawls. "Saw him by the yews again. Why's he always there? Scared to tell." No names, but the entries pointed to a man. Miss Marple, joining Neil, read the diary with a frown. Poor girl, she was watching someone, wasn't she? Someone who knew she'd seen too much. Neil agreed, his mind on Lance. He confronted him again, this time in the library. "Mr. Fortescue, Gladys saw you by the yews. Care to explain?" Lance's smile was gone. "She was mistaken, Inspector. I told you, I like the grounds. Nothing sinister about it." The day wore on, the household tense. Percival, in the study, found another letter from a creditor, this one threatening legal action. He burned it, his hands shaking. Elaine, in her room, wrote another letter to her sister, her words vague but fearful. Lance, in the garage, planned his next move, his thoughts on the Swiss account. Miss Marple, dining with the family, observed their strained interactions. Percival was curt, Elaine withdrawn, Lance overly cheerful. "Such a tragedy," she said, passing the peas. "It reminds me of a case in my village, a man who hid his crimes behind clever distractions." Lance's fork paused, his eyes sharp. "Clever, Miss Marple? You think our killer's clever?" "Oh, very," she said, her smile bland. "But cleverness often trips itself up." That night, Neil reviewed the case at the inn, his diagram now a web of names and motives. The rhyme was a taunt, but the real clue lay in the money, or the lack of it. He resolved to press Percival harder about the firm. Miss Marple, in her room, knitted slowly, her mind on Gladys's diary. The girl had seen someone, and it had cost her life. The rhyme was a red herring, but the truth was close. She could feel it. In the garden, the blackbirds stirred, their cries faint in the darkness. Yew Tree Lodge held its secrets, but the threads were tightening, and revelations were near. Chapter 9. The Prodigal's Mask. The 6th day at Yew Tree Lodge dawned with a deceptive serenity, the morning light filtering through the yew trees to cast dappled patterns across the dew-soaked lawn. The blackbirds, ever present, flitted among the hedges, their calls a sharp counterpoint to the heavy silence within the house. The murders of Rex Fortescue, Adele, and now Gladys Martin had woven a tapestry of fear, each thread tied to the haunting nursery rhyme that seemed to mock the living. The clothes peg on Gladys's nose, the rye grains, the blackbird pie. All pointed to a killer with a flair for the dramatic, but Miss Jane Marple and Inspector Neil were closing in, their suspicions converging on the tangled motives within the family. Miss Marple sat in her guest room, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm as she reviewed the case. The rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence," was a deliberate veil, she was certain, designed to distract from a simpler truth. "Money or revenge," she murmured, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. "It's always one or the other." She thought of a Saint Mary Mead case, where a charming young man had used flattery to mask a theft. Here the charm was Lancelot Fortescue's, his prodigal return timed too neatly with the deaths. The blue cashmere scrap, Gladys's diary, the blackbird mine. All pointed to him, but proof was elusive. Inspector Neil, in the library, was grappling with the same puzzle. The diary found in Gladys's room had hinted at a man by the U's, and the cashmere scrap suggested a scarf, possibly Lance's. The Swiss account, locked without Rex's signature, was a motive, but for whom? Percival's secrecy about the firm's finances was troubling, yet Lance's history with the Blackbird mine and his sudden reappearance made him the more likely suspect. Neil had requested a deeper investigation into Lance's African ventures, suspecting a scandal buried in his past. He summoned Mary Dove to the library, her composed presence a stark contrast to the household's fraying nerves. "Miss Dove," he began, his notebook open, "you've observed the family closely. Mr. Lancelot, has he been acting differently since Gladys's death?" Mary's eyes flickered, her hands smoothing her apron. "He's been quieter, Inspector, but still charming when it suits him. Yesterday he was in the garage all morning, then out walking in the evening. Said he needed to think. And his interactions with Gladys, did you ever see them together?" "Once or twice," Mary replied. "She served him tea in the billiard room. He was kind to her, gave her a shilling once, but she seemed nervous around him, more than with the others." Neil made a note, his thoughts on Gladys's diary. He thanked Mary and moved to the study, where Percival was sorting through a pile of correspondence, his face haggard. "Mr. Fortescue," Neil said, "your brother's return. Did it surprise you?" Percival's pen paused, his lips thinning. "Surprise? No, Inspector. Lance always had a knack for showing up when it suited him. Father was softening toward him, though, talked of revising the will." Neil's interest sharpened. "Revising it how?" "To give Lance a larger share, provided he settled down. I told Father it was a mistake. Lance hasn't changed." Neil nodded, filing the detail away. He sought out Elaine next, finding her in the morning room, stitching a sampler with unsteady hands. "Mrs. Fortescue," he said, "you mentioned a letter from Mr. Dubois. Any other correspondence you've received recently?" Elaine's needle paused, her face paling. "No, Inspector. Just personal notes. Nothing to do with this." Neil pressed gently. "And your husband, has he shared anything about the firm's troubles?" Elaine hesitated, her voice low. "He's worried, I know that. Says the Blackbird mine ruined everything, but he won't tell me more." Neil thanked her and moved to the garage, where Lancelot was polishing his car, his movements brisk, but his eyes watchful. "Mr. Fortescue," Neil said, "Gladys's diary mentioned a man by the U's. You've been seen there. Care to explain?" Lance's smile was tight. "I like the grounds, Inspector. Told you that. If Gladys saw me, she was mistaken about anything sinister." "And your time in Africa? Any enemies from the Blackbird mine?" Lance's eyes hardened. "Plenty, but none who'd follow me here. That was Father's mess, not mine." Neil left, his suspicions unresolved. He returned to the library where Miss Marple was sipping tea, her knitting a constant companion. "Inspector," she said, "I've been thinking about Gladys's diary. She saw a man, and it frightened her. In my village, a girl once saw something she shouldn't. A theft, it turned out. The thief silenced her." Neil nodded, intrigued. "You think Gladys saw the killer?" "Or something close to it," Miss Marple said. "The rhyme is a distraction, but the motive is clear. Money, or the lack of it. The Blackbird mine keeps coming up, doesn't it?" Neil shared the latest on the Swiss account, and Miss Marple's eyes lit up. "A locked fortune. Now that's a reason to kill. Someone wanted it, or wanted it hidden." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village church, seeking the quiet of its ancient pews. The vicar, Mr. Thompson, was arranging hymnals, his face somber. "Miss Marple," he said, "these murders, they're the talk of the parish. Folks say it's a curse on the Fortescues." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No curse, Reverend, just human greed. Tell me, have you heard anything new about Mr. Lancelot's time abroad?" The vicar hesitated. "Only whispers. He was mixed up in a mining deal that went sour. Some say he swindled investors. His father sent him away to avoid scandal." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on a saint. Mary Mead swindler, who had charmed his way into trust. She returned to the lodge, where she found Elaine in the conservatory, watering plants with a distracted air. "Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said, "you've been so brave through this. Did Gladys ever mention Mr. Lancelot to you?" Elaine's hand trembled, spilling water. She said he was kind, but she didn't like serving him alone, said he watched her too closely. Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Interesting. And Mr. Dubois, did he ever speak of Mr. Lancelot?" Elaine flushed. "Once. He said Lance was trouble, always scheming, but it was just talk." Miss Marple thanked her and moved to the garden, where she examined the yew hedge again. The trampled grass was inconclusive, but she noted a faint mark in the soil. A boot print, perhaps, too large for Jenkins. She filed it away, her mind on Lance's restless movements. Inspector Neal, meanwhile, received a telegram from Scotland Yard. The Blackbird mine scandal had involved forged documents, with Lance implicated but never charged. A witness, a former partner named Carter, had claimed Lance falsified reports to lure investors. Carter was now in London, and Neely arranged to interview him. He confronted Lance again, this time in the billiard room, where the younger man was lining up a shot. "Mr. Fortescue, we've uncovered evidence of fraud in the Blackbird mine. Your name came up." Lance's cue struck the ball sharply, sending it spinning. "Old news, Inspector. I was young, made mistakes. Father covered it up. And now you're back, with your father and stepmother dead. Convenient, isn't it?" Lance's smile vanished. "You think I'd kill for money? I'm not that desperate." Neil let him go, his suspicions hardening. He sought out Vivian Dubois, who was at the golf club chatting with a local businessman. "Mr. Dubois," Neil said, "you knew of the Blackbird mine scandal. Did Mrs. Fortescue ever mention it?" Vivian's expression tightened. "Adele knew Lance was trouble, said he'd do anything to get back in his father's good graces or his money." Neil pressed further. "And you? Any dealings with the mine?" "None," Vivian said firmly. "I steer clear of risky ventures." Back at the lodge, Miss Marple joined Neil in the library, sharing her observations. "Inspector, the boot print by the yews, it's too large for Jenkins, and Gladys's fear of Mr. Lancelot. He's central, I think." Neil nodded, his mind on the fraud. "We're close, Miss Marple. The mine, the account, the murders, it's all connected." That evening, Miss Marple requested a family gathering in the drawing room, her presence a quiet authority. Percival, Elaine, and Lance sat in a tense semicircle, their faces reflecting suspicion and fatigue. Neil stood by the fireplace, his notebook ready. "Such a sad affair," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle. "It reminds me of a case in my village, a boy who forged notes to inherit a fortune. He was clever, but careless." Her eyes settled on Lance. "Mr. Fortescue, you've been abroad, haven't you? Tell us about the Blackbird mine." Lance's smile was strained. "A failed venture, Miss Marple, nothing more. But it cost your father dearly, she said, her needles clicking. And now you're back, just as he dies. The rye, the blackbirds, the peg, all so theatrical, like a story you might tell. Lance's eyes hardened. You're fishing, Miss Marple. I'm no killer. Percival interrupted, his voice sharp. Lance, you've always been trouble. Father knew it. Elaine gripped her husband's arm. Stop it, Percival. Miss Marple continued, undeterred. Gladys saw something, didn't she? By the yews where you were seen, Mr. Fortescue. She wrote of a man, and it frightened her. Lance stood, his face pale. This is nonsense. I'm not on trial. Neil stepped forward. Not yet, Mr. Fortescue, but we've evidence. Forged documents from the mine, your name on them, and a witness in London. Lance's composure cracked, his voice rising. You've nothing solid, Inspector, just guesses. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Greed is a powerful thing, Mr. Fortescue. It makes people careless. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Lance stormed out, his footsteps echoing in the hall. Percival and Elaine exchanged glances, their fear unspoken. Neil followed Lance, stopping him in the hall. We'll be watching you, Mr. Fortescue. Don't leave the estate. That night, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting slowly. The boot print, the diary, Lance's past. It all pointed to him, but she needed proof. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead murderer, who had overplayed his hand, leaving one clue too many. Neil, at the inn, reviewed the evidence. The forged documents, the cashmere scrap, the rhyme. It was a web, and Lance was at its center. He resolved to confront Carter tomorrow. In the darkness, Yew Tree Lodge was quiet, the blackbirds silent. The prodigal's mask was slipping, and the truth was near. Chapter 10. The Final Verse. The seventh day at Yew Tree Lodge broke with a chill wind sweeping across the estate, rattling the windows and stirring the yew trees into restless motion. The blackbirds, undaunted, darted through the garden, their sharp cries weaving a discordant melody against the backdrop of a house steeped in dread. The murders of Rex Fortescue, Adele, and Gladys Martin had cast a long shadow, each death marked by the sinister thread of a nursery rhyme that seemed to taunt the living. The clothes peg on Gladys's nose, the rye grains, the blackbird pie, all were pieces of a puzzle that Miss Jane Marple and Inspector Neil were determined to solve, their suspicions now firmly fixed on Lancelot Fortescue, whose prodigal return had heralded this deadly chain. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles moving with a deliberate calm as she pieced together the final threads of the case. The rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," was a clever distraction, she was certain, masking a motive rooted in greed or vengeance. The blue cashmere scrap, Gladys's diary, the Blackbird mine scandal, and the locked Swiss account all pointed to Lance, whose charm concealed a calculating mind. "It's like that affair in St. Mary Mead," she murmured, recalling a case where a charming curate had hidden his thefts behind a facade of piety. The mask is slipping, and the truth is near. Inspector Neil, stationed in the library, was equally resolute. The telegram from Scotland Yard had confirmed Lance's involvement in the Blackbird mine fraud, with forged documents bearing his signature. The witness, Carter, had agreed to testify, claiming Lance had swindled investors and fled to Africa to escape prosecution. The Swiss account, tied to the mine's profits, was inaccessible without Rex's signature, a motive for murder if Lance sought to claim it. The blue cashmere scrap, possibly from a scarf, and Gladys's diary entries about a man by the U's strengthened the case against him. Yet Neil needed concrete evidence to make an arrest. He summoned Mary Dove to the library, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the household's fraying nerves. "Miss Dove," he began, his notebook open, "you've been observant. Mr. Lancelot, any recent interactions with the staff that struck you as odd?" Mary's eyes flickered, her hands clasped tightly. "He's been charming, as always, Inspector, but distant since Gladys's death. Yesterday he asked me about the yew trees, wanted to know if Jenkins ever left them unattended. I thought it peculiar." Neil's pen paused. "Peculiar how?" "He seemed too curious, like he was testing me." Neil made a note, his suspicions hardening. He thanked Mary and moved to the study, where Percival Fortescue was hunched over a ledger, his face etched with strain. "Mr. Fortescue," Neil said, "we've evidence of your brother's fraud in the Blackbird mine. Did you know he falsified documents?" Percival's eyes widened, then narrowed. "I suspected, Inspector. Father covered it up, sent him away, but Lance never admitted it." "And the Swiss account, did you know its purpose?" Percival hesitated, his voice low. "Father hinted it was a safeguard, for emergencies. I didn't know the details." Neil pressed further. "And your brother's return, did it worry you?" "Of course," Percival snapped. "Lance always brought trouble. Father was going to revise the will in his favor. Foolish, I told him." Neil nodded, filing the detail away. He sought out Elaine next, finding her in the conservatory, pruning roses with a distracted air. "Mrs. Fortescue," he said, "your husband mentioned a possible change to the will. Did you know of it?" Elaine's shears paused, her face paling. "Percival said something about it, yes. Rex thought Lance had changed, wanted to give him a chance. I thought it risky." "And Mr. Dubois, any further contact?" "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "Just that one note. He's kept his distance." Neil thanked her and moved to the garage, where Lancelot was cleaning his car's windshield, his movements brisk, but his eyes guarded. "Mr. Fortescue," Neil said, "we've a witness who says you forged documents for the Blackbird mine. Care to comment?" Lance's cloth paused, his smile tight. "Carter, I presume?" "He's a liar, Inspector. Always was. I made mistakes, but forgery? That's a stretch." "And your interest in the yew trees? You asked Miss Dove about them." Lance's eyes narrowed. "Curiosity, nothing more. They're a feature of the estate." Neil let him go, his suspicions unassuaged. He returned to the library where Miss Marple was sipping tea, her knitting a constant companion. "Inspector," she said, "I've been thinking about the rhyme's final verse. The maid's nose, Gladys's death, was the last act, wasn't it? But the motive lies in the past, with the mine." Neil nodded, sharing Carter's testimony. Miss Marple's eyes lit up. "Forgery is a bold crime, Inspector. It takes planning, like these murders. And the rhyme? It's a flourish, to make us look at the spectacle, not the truth." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village post office, chatting with Mrs. Price, whose gossip was a gold mine. "Mrs. Price," she said, "any talk of Mr. Lancelot's return? He's quite the figure, isn't he?" Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice low. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. Folks say he came back broke, looking for his father's money. There's talk he owed debts in Africa. Dangerous people." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on a saint. Mary Mead debtor who had staged a robbery to cover his tracks. She returned to the lodge where she found Percival in the study, his face buried in papers. "Mr. Fortescue," she said, her tone gentle, "you've been under such strain. The firm's troubles must weigh heavily." Percival looked up, his eyes weary. "They do, Miss Marple. Father's ventures, especially the mine, left us in a mess. I'm trying to save it." "And your brother, did he know of the Swiss account?" Percival hesitated. "He might have. Father was secretive, but Lance has a way of ferreting things out." Miss Marple thanked him and moved to the drawing-room, where Elaine was arranging flowers, her hands unsteady. "Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple said, "you've been so strong. Did Mr. Lancelot ever speak of his plans now that he's back?" Elaine's vase tilted, water spilling. He said he wanted a fresh start, but he was angry with Rex, I could tell. Said he'd been cheated." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Cheated, you say? That's a strong word." Elaine flushed, turning away. Miss Marple moved to the garden, where she examined the yew hedge again. The boot print was gone, washed away by rain, but she noted a faint scratch on a low branch, as if something had caught there. A scarf, perhaps? Inspector Neal, meanwhile, received a call from Scotland Yard. Carter's testimony was damning. Lance had falsified reports to inflate the mine's value, pocketing funds before the collapse. He had fled to Africa, but debts followed him. Neal arranged for Carter to come to Baden Heath, hoping a confrontation would crack Lance's facade. He sought out Vivian Dubois at the golf club, where the instructor was practicing putts with a studied calm. "Mr. Dubois," Neal said, "you knew of Lance's troubles in Africa. Did he ever mention debts?" Vivian's putter paused. "He hinted at it, Inspector, said he'd left some messes behind, but he was vague. I told him to steer clear of trouble here." Neal pressed further. "And Mrs. Fortescue, did she know of his plans?" "Adele suspected he was after the money," Vivian said. "She didn't trust him." Back at the lodge, Miss Marple and Neal conferred in the library. "Inspector," she said, "the rhyme is a distraction, but the mine is the key. Lance's fraud, the locked account, it's all about control." Neal nodded, his mind on Carter's testimony. "We're close, Miss Marple. If we can prove Lance accessed the poisons, we've got him." That evening, Miss Marple requested another family gathering in the drawing room, her presence a quiet command. Percival, Elaine, and Lance sat in a tense semicircle, their faces reflecting fear and suspicion. Neal stood by the door, his notebook ready. "Such a tragic affair," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but firm. "It reminds me of a case in my village, a young man who used charm to hide his greed. He planned carefully, but left one clue too many." Her eyes settled on Lance. "Mr. Fortescue, you returned just in time, didn't you? Just as your father was reconsidering his will." Lance's smile was strained. "Coincidence, Miss Marple. I wanted to make amends." "But you needed money," she said, her needles still. "The Blackbird mine left you in debt, didn't it? And the Swiss account, locked away, unless your father and Adele were gone?" Lance's face paled, his voice rising. "You're spinning tales, old woman. I've done nothing." Percival leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You've always been a liar, Lance. Father saw through you." Elaine gripped her husband's arm. "Please, Percival." Miss Marple continued, undeterred. "Gladys saw you, Mr. Fortescue, by the yews. She wrote of a man, and it frightened her. You poisoned your father with taxine from those berries, didn't you? Then Adele, with cyanide in her marmalade, to clear the way for the inheritance. And Gladys, poor Gladys, she knew too much, so you silenced her with a scarf, leaving that peg to fit the rhyme." Lance stood, his hands clenched. "This is absurd. You've no proof." Neil stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We've Carter, Mr. Fortescue. He's coming tomorrow to testify about your fraud. And the cashmere scrap. It matches a scarf you bought in London." Lance's composure shattered, his voice a snarl. "Father ruined me, cut me off for one mistake. I deserved that money, more than Percival, more than Adele. The rhyme was just a bit of fun to keep you guessing." The room froze, the confession hanging in the air. Elaine gasped, her hands covering her mouth. Percival stared, his face ashen. Miss Marple's eyes softened with pity. "Greed, Mr. Fortescue," she said. "It always betrays itself." Neil signaled to Sergeant Hay, who entered with handcuffs. "Lancelot Fortescue, you're under arrest for the murders of Rex Fortescue, Adele Fortescue, and Gladys Martin." Lance struggled briefly, then sagged, his charm gone. "It was mine," he muttered, "all of it." As he was led away, the house exhaled, the tension breaking like a storm. Percival buried his face in his hands, Elaine weeping beside him. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts on the rhyme's final verse, now complete. Neil thanked her later, in the library. "You saw it, Miss Marple, the rhyme as a distraction. I'd have been chasing it for weeks." She smiled faintly. "Human nature, Inspector. It's the same in St. Mary Mead as here. Greed sings its own song, and we only need listen." That night, Yew Tree Lodge was quiet, the blackbirds silent in their roosts. The final verse had been sung, and the truth stood bare, like rye grains scattered in the wind.